All right, so welcome to the PolyPsych podcast. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay. I'm here with Dr. Seyb from Skidmore College. So my first question to you is, what is it like in academia, and would you recommend students thinking of pursuing their PhD to actually follow through with their plans to become a professor?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll try to give a brief answer to it. I have to say, I think it's the best job I could ever imagine for myself. As you know, with the following caveat, as we say, if you're in an academic job, you're compensated in time and not necessarily in money. So we don't earn a lot of money. You can do a lot better if you do a startup in Silicon Valley or go in corporate management. But I do have a lot of latitude in terms of scheduling my own day, and I get to pursue whatever kind of research project that I want, and there are no constraints there. I really teach the courses that I want to teach for the most part. So again, I love the freedom. And again, if you're interested in ideas and you're interested in learning about their history and their application to contemporary problems, there's just no better job to be in. I'm actually paid to read. And I know not everybody loves to read, but for me, I can't think of something that's better. So if you love being a student, it's a wonderful job to pursue. On the other hand, it is a fairly tight job market in the academy. You've probably heard, or many of your listeners have heard about the kind of nomadic, what we call adjunct faculty who can't get a tenure track job, that can't get a permanent position in a college or university. So they teach a course, at one place, teach another course across town at another college. And that's a very difficult life because you don't have a lot of continuity or certainty or predictability to it. And because what we call tenure track jobs are so few, the competition of those jobs are fierce. And I can say, being on this side of the table where I'm actually doing the hiring or part of the hiring, I mean, we get so many outstanding applicants. It's so hard to say no to them. But when you have 130 applicants for a single job,
wow,
chances are you're going to be, chances are you get a sense, right? That's in my discipline. Other disciplines is even more competitive, such as departments of English or philosophy, or departments of history, even more in the humanities. It can be even more competitive. You get 200 or 250 applicants for the same job. I mean, chances are that 50 of those applicants would be outstanding hires, but you have to make these sort of finely grained distinctions among very, very talented, very, very well-credentialed applicants. And frankly, it's very dispiriting sometimes. So I always tell my students who are interested in pursuing, an advanced degree, a PhD, the terminal degree, always be thinking about not only just sort of how much you love being in school and how much you love doing the research and the ideas, but you also have to think about it more pragmatically too. Is this something that you're willing, for example, to spend 5 or 6 years in adjunct positions or temporary positions? Is that a lifestyle that you find to be at all tolerable, with the hope at some point that you're going to be able to pivot into a tenure track job? But again, that's also a bit contingent on a lot of factors. So it is a kind of on balance thing, right? It's sort of like, it's a great position if you can get it.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing from a lot of professors, is that the running joke is that, like, they discourage you from going into academia, and they themselves are professors. They're like, don't do it. Like, find something else to do. I think the academic freedom is.
Say, don't follow my example. I think again, I'm sure I'm just repeating what you've heard from many of your other faculty, is that, again, they love their job. They love the fact that they have so much freedom. They love the fact that they get to work with, really kind of interested, curious, talented undergraduates. I love the age group of 18 to 21 or 22. I think you're coming into your own in so many different ways, and you're sort of developing your interests and sort of defining your life goals at this point. It's just a great launching pad period, and I love to be part of that. But on the other hand, it's just a very, and it's always been a very constricted job market. I can say, when I came onto the job market back in 1988, I was told by some of my faculty, okay, it's a very tight job market, but it's getting better because there's a generation of faculty who are kind of aging out of the profession. A lot of tenure track jobs are going to open up. And that just never happened. Again, I had this large time, it's 30 years, and that promise has never been realized. So I think you just have to go in with a gimlet eye. And that's why I also tell my students, you really have to be committed to this. You really have to. It's not just being good at school. And I'll tell you something. I have people in my family who are so much smarter than I am, and we're such better students than I was, or I am right now, because I'm still a student. But they just didn't have kind of the temperament They didn't have the real kind of interest in ideas for their own sake sometimes. They weren't really interested in writing a dissertation or writing a book. That just wasn't something that really gave them a sense of accomplishment or a sense of reward. And so they're extraordinarily smart, but it's not the right profession for them.
I'd imagine so.
Yeah.
Speaking on the dissertation, like that seems to be like the one of the biggest obstacles, especially first starting out, is that like you're a PhD student and you have this brick wall of a dissertation to hop over. Like you have students that are what they call ABD, all but dissertation, and that's like the last piece before you can venture out into the world, and yet it's still an obstacle, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I love the metaphor of the brick wall because it does feel like a brick wall that you have to scale. You can't go through, right? It's going to take time. You're going to have to get a foothold. You're going to have to climb. You're going to fall down a few times as well. I mean, and that is, I always, tell students who I think have the talent the talent, aptitude, and temperament to go into graduate school that there are a lot of, as you said, ABDs, all but dissertation out there. That is, they run into that brick wall and they just can't climb over it or they can't get through it. And a graduate education is very different from an undergraduate education in the following sense. First, you do coursework in graduate school, but the coursework is not really that important. There's usually some sort of threshold grade you have to get in order to move on to what's called your qualifying exams, which are comprehensive exams in a field. Like for me, I had to take comprehensive exams in American politics and comparative politics and international relations. And so that's kind of the first sort of winnowing point. But the dissertation is really the point where you're really preparing yourself for this career because you have to demonstrate that you're somebody who can actually be an independent scholar. You can come up with your own idea and you can bring it to fruition. And in some ways, it actually is a good test because you probably heard of publish or perish. The reality of a tenure track job is that if you're not an active scholar, if you're not publishing things, if you're not, in my discipline, if you're not writing books or placing articles in very prestigious journals, you're probably not going to get what's called tenure. They're probably going to let you go after 6 years. It really is that moment where you have to demonstrate, and it is a very lonely kind of experience because, you have an advisor, but your advisor usually is supervising 6 or 7 or 8 dissertations, so they only have, 1/8 of their time that they're carving out to work with graduate students being devoted to you. So you're not going to get a lot of kind of really, close attention. So you really are on your own. And for that reason, again, it is understandable why a lot of people don't finish the dissertation. Now, on the other hand, I said, it prepares you for the career, it prepares you really for one part of an academic career because you're also going to have to teach. And so that is the issue because, and I think this is changing in graduate schools, at least in my discipline, where when I was being trained in the 1980s, I was really just being trained to be a scholar, to be pure mind. And I got very little teaching or pedagogical instruction. I was thrown into a class as a TA with, they just gave me the textbook and said, go to it. So there was no like discussion about what I might encounter or here's some tips, some hints for how you actually can navigate the classroom or read students. It's just like, you go in there and do the best you can and hopefully you don't get too many flesh wounds and you'll be fine. And now I think they're doing more with graduate students in most institutions to try to train them to be teachers. But still, it's a big leap to go from this world in which you're just a student and you're working on your own independent research to be in front of a class of 20, 25, or, maybe at your institution, 150 or 200 students. And the expectation is that you know what you're doing.
And it's like you do not. So your research interests coming out and going into your profession, your research interests have been political oratory and presidential management, specifically in the executive branch. So what have been like some of your most interesting findings? Yeah,
well, I sort of, and this is, I guess, I'm at a liberal arts college, so I'm at a small college, and there's a lot of encouragement to kind of do a lot of different kinds of research. So early in my career, I did a fair amount on, as you said, sort of presidential management of the executive branch, which has become much more, I think, timely now during the Trump era than during my era from the fact that Trump has not really made many political appointments. So, when I was confronting this back in the 1980s and 1990s, this issue as it was, the big question was sort of how do political appointees manage what was called the permanent bureaucracy or the Washington establishment and the tension between the career civil servants, those people who are there from administration who are, at least in principle, supposed to be nonpartisan and neutral. How does the political appointee come into the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the Department of Agriculture and actually make change? because that career level of personnel are usually very resistant to change, and sometimes for good reason. It's not just because they're intransigent or they're sort of hidebound and cloaked in tradition, but they know what works and they know what doesn't work. And they've seen political appointees come in and try to send things on a different trajectory, and it doesn't work. There was a very famous book by a guy named Hugh Hecklow called The Government of Strangers, which was that, you bring in these political appointees, they're there normally for 2.5 years. They confront a bunch of strangers, right? These bureaucrats who they have no relationship with. And it's always a very tension-filled kind of unproductive relationship. Now, during the Trump year, in many of these departments and agencies, as many of your listeners probably know, Trump has been very reluctant to fill those kind of, undersecretary, deputy secretary, bureau chief positions. As a consequence, that doesn't mean suddenly that these departments and agencies aren't functioning anymore. It means that the career civil servants are now running those agencies and departments. So the paradox is, Trump's, one of his big, I guess, sort of promises in the campaign was to, go in there and kind of break apart the Washington establishment, the permanent government in Washington. But what he's really done is empower them. And so I almost wish I was still doing that work. I've kind of deviated from it, but I think it's a really interesting moment where, again, by failing to act, by being so passive or so, I guess, dismissive of the process of appointing officials into these departments and agencies, what you've done is you empowered those people who you campaigned against. Oh, wow. So I think that's one of the more interesting things that's happened since when I was studying it, where I was really more interested in sort of how do political appointees navigate the permanent bureaucracy? Are the kind of structural changes that you can make through what was called at that point executive branch reorganization that kind of streamline things, give you greater control over the career bureaucracy. Now you're in this moment where, there's just the current president is not interested at all in the executive establishment. So it's sort of letting the career bureaucrats have a lot of sway and latitude.
Is that better?
Again, the political appointees he does have are in complete, are fighting them in these very open and very public ways. It used to be kind of this clandestine warfare that went on and the public wasn't aware of it. But when you bring, Scott Pruitt and the EPA, that's suddenly like this huge public fight. So it's much more salient now.
I wonder if that's better. I mean, you have career bureaucrats who have focused on this one thing for so long. I would equate it to like how professors are. When you study this one specific thing for so long, you have a generalist come in. He may have popular approval, but I mean, do you really know the intricacies of the EPA?
Well, that's a really good point, and that's why again when I was talking earlier, I was saying again, oftentimes the reason why career civil servants have a reputation for being dragging their feet and being so recalcitrant is that, you have to remember that it's not just they pass the test. Some people think, well, they all take a certain civil service test and they're able to figure out how to pass this. They come with real strong professional credentials. I mean, EPA has a number of people who are engineers and scientists. Or they have training in public policy. So they have real experts in whatever it is, whether it's, water control, pollution abatement, et cetera. So in many ways, I mean, their arguments are going to be better because they had that sort of foundation of expertise. A political appointment usually is just that. It's somebody who comes in without that kind of training or specialization. They have a different kind of agenda, of course. And sometimes, again, I think that's a very healthy tension between the political appointee and the bureaucrat, where the political appointee comes in with a kind of mandate in some ways to make changes. And that has to be respected by the career service, right? They're not, as is often said by critics of the career service, they're not elected by anybody, so they're not accountable to anybody. And that's a problem in a democracy. So you want to have those political appointees come in to sort of bring the voice of the people or the populace too, and bring in new ideas and try to shake things up. So in some ways, that could be a very healthy tension between those two sort of forces. I think I want both of them in my government. I want both people who have training, expertise, and some specialization on one side, but I also want people who are actually accountable to me as a voter, have some sort of mandate to change things so that things don't become too static. So I think that's a real healthy thing. But as you said, it is an interesting dynamic we have. And it's not really replicated by any other industrial democracy. To have this sort of, this political layer and this bureaucratic layer so closely wedded to each other.
Huh. All right, so in comparing it to different eras, like I know the Trump era is completely different than what we've seen in history. But in comparing like the Carter, Reagan, Obama, Trump, like how do you think the rhetoric, like just the stuff they say, and especially in their speeches, have changed over time? And has the era of civility and the prestige of the presidency subsided to a more like visceral, like shoot from the hip way of speaking? And is that better, you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a great question. And I think I like the last part, is it better or not? And I'll just sort of start with, I taught a course last spring, after the election of Donald Trump, called Demagogues, Demons, and Democracy, the Sources of Our Venomous Politics.
Oh, I would have taken that class.
well, those who took it were not probably as happy as they thought they would get. I'm not sure it was a wildly successful course, but it allowed me, and we actually did a more historical analysis of, political discourse and political speech. And I pointed out, we've had actually several moments in American history where the political discourse was pretty venomous and unpleasant. I mean, I always talk about, Abraham Lincoln being called all sorts of vile names, which is true too. But we spent a lot of time, probably too much time for the students' taste, talking about the populist movement of the late 19th, early 20th century with, household name William Jennings Bryan at the head of it. But the populist movement was really a movement primarily of farmers in the West, who felt as if, again, it's going to, in many ways, what I'm going to say will map on to the current point. It really felt like they were being, in some ways, gouged, their livelihoods being destroyed by big corporations, primarily the railroads, but the so-called trust, the steel trust, for example, the rubber trust, et cetera. So we had this really grassroots movement. It came from the heartland. It was average Americans. There are a lot of actually very famous populist senators and politicians. Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, probably the most notable. So they actually had some political clout too. They actually elected representatives and senators. They had a presidential candidate named William Jennings Bryan, who was actually adopted by the Democratic Party as their standard bearer in 1896. A really important movement. But there's a real strong element in this populist movement of nativism and xenophobia and racism. A lot of it directed against African Americans, for example, but also against Catholics. I point out, we do a lot of readings in that course about the anti-Catholicism that was behind a lot of the populist rhetoric. That was, again, it was a Protestant movement, and it was really against it. It was anti-Catholicism that was tinctured with xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, because most of the Catholics were Irish or Italian or German or Czech. So the anti-Catholicism was in many ways entwined with the anti-immigrant, and it was really a toxic brew. Some of the same things that William Jennings Bryan said in the 1896 election were appalling, even at the time. We think, the time was much more, shall we say, repressive. But William Jennings Bryan was talking about, the populist movement is designed to try to push back the refuse from Europe that's washing up on our shores. People who were who knew who they were at that point. So there's always been strain in our politics of, I would say, unbridled, sometimes offensive political discourse. Now, and this is where I don't like to be a technological determinist, but I think with the rise of social media and other platforms that sort of, I think, amplifies these voices, we're hearing more of it. But there's always been this element of sort of, as I would call it, sort of unbridled, very aggressive, even venomous discourse in American politics. And part of that is I think that there's something very positive about that. That's part of the First Amendment, right? We don't regulate speech, or the content of speech at least. There's a very famous Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan, which deals with the question. I just read about it. Yeah, you probably know it, right? In open society, our speech has to be, sometimes it's going to be offensive. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be confrontational, contentious, but that's part of a democracy. And the best response to speech that you think is contentious or you think is overly exaggerated is more speech, right? Combat that with argumentation. So it's not new that we have this kind of, as you say, I think, visceral speech that comes from the gut, that's emotional, that may be beyond facts. But I think it's just the case that now there are just so many multiple platforms where we're encountering it. It seems like it's a new phenomenon. I think it's now a bigger phenomenon, and maybe actually more corrosive to our body politic, in the sense that now it seems to be omnipresent. But we've always had this element. And I say part of it is just being in a free society that values free speech, that treats the First Amendment as sacrosanct. And I'm actually all for those principles. But this is the consequence of living in a country where we really do take freedom of speech and freedom of expression very seriously.
So in this particular context, where there are so many platforms and you could literally get news 24 hours. I mean, we do have 24-hour news cycle. So just switching gears a bit, the state of journalism has been reduced to talking heads, like pretty much yelling their opinion. So should newspapers and journalism as a whole be more scientifically based, especially in terms of using social sciences and academic research as their springboard for their daily news stories? And at the same time, is the 24-hour news cycle even good for the nation, or is it a net negative?
Yeah, and I think those are all really good questions. The first, to get to the question of, should journalism be more scientific? I'm actually checking my bookshelf. I can't find it right now. There's a really good book on evidence-based journalism. I wish I could convey it to your readers. It's written by a guy, I think by the name of David Patterson, which I actually assigned to my students. And his argument is that he makes the point that you made, that there's been a degeneration of journalism in many, oh, here it is. I'm sorry. I found it. The advantage of doing this from my office. It's a book by Thomas Patterson called Informing the News, the Need for Knowledge-Based Journalism. What Patterson points out is what you're saying. There's been a kind of, I would say, he doesn't use this language, I'm going to be more provocative, but kind of a fleeing from objectivity, a kind of sense that now we're more in a world of the commentariat, where people are simply, particularly on cable news, to talk about journalism is almost in some ways misleading, because journalism is now subdivided into so many different kinds of subcultures. There's the New York Times, and then there's Breitbart, and there's Fox News, and then there's, The Economist. So are they really in the same lane? But what he argues is that actually journalists one of the benefits of this moment, when there are so many different sources of information, where I can go online now and I can actually look at what's being published by, scholars, and what's being, published by reputable think tanks, that journalism doesn't have to rely on its old model, which was the interviews-based model of accumulating information and data. Like, it used to be human intelligence. You would just go out and talk to, a couple of sources. If your listeners are familiar with the movie All the President's Men, it's a movie about, Woodward and Bernstein. And, the whole thing there was about the two-source rule. Who are your sources? Are they credible? Are they people who we know? Are they part of the Washington? What Patterson is arguing in this book is that you don't really need human intelligence anymore, because you have so much data evidence. It's the era of big data, and that journalists can become much more evidence-based. I think there's some evidence of that's actually happening. I think as much as we talk about journalism going into the dark ages now, or an age of decay, there's so much better long-form journalism available now, on places like ProPublica, for example, or even Vox and places like that, where people are writing these long stories, which are real deep dives into a subject or into an issue or into a personality than I can ever remember back when I was growing up. I mean, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was this worry that all journalism was going to be distilled down to soundbite journalism. Like, everything would just be like a 15-second clip on the nightly news. And I think we've gone in the opposite direction. There's too much commentary. People are giving too much time to. But I also think that one of the positive externalities of the growth of space on the internet is that now, you have people who are serious journalists or public intellectuals having the opportunity to write at length about subjects that would not make the nightly news necessarily. So I think that's been a very healthy thing. But I think that the sort of idea of evidence-based journalism I find very attractive, with the following, I think, proviso, that it's not just the presentation of the evidence or information, it's the interpretation of it too. And that's something we can discover in our modern moment, right? Again, we have we have an information glut out there. I mean, we've never had access to so much information, but translating that into knowledge is difficult, because you can interpret information in such a way that it's tendentious, that it's self-interested, that it plays to your pre-existing beliefs. This is a PolyPsych broadcast, so I'm not uncomfortable saying, people have a confirmation bias, or the victims of cognitive dissonance, where they search the information environment to find strands of information that can tie to their existing beliefs and reinforce them or tether them. So as much as we want to think that, journalists are as guilty of this too, right? They're human beings as well. So they also go into their stories with a set of preconceived beliefs, or a set of assumptions, or a set of values, and they're looking for information. Maybe it's not consciously, but certainly under the threshold of consciousness, that confirms those beliefs or values. So information's not enough. It's also the kind of frame you use, and be very mindful of our own kind of vulnerabilities or frailties as human beings, that we're prone to gravitate to information that in many ways confirms what we already know.
That's what we figure. I mean, people typically gravitate towards what they've already believed before even going into the story. The running joke is like, you you make up your mind and then you go to imright.com and look up statistics on it. So
exactly. Yeah, there's a very famous political scientist, psychologist, who was actually the person who developed cognitive dissonance theory, who said we're not rational, we're rationalizing. That is, as you said, we make choices or we engage in behavior, and then we look at that choice again under the threshold of consciousness, or we look at that behavior and say, okay, so why did I do that? What is the most sort of face-saving explanation for that? And then we develop our own theories of the world that explains that behavior in a way that in some ways preserves our dignity or our sense of self. So yeah, you always, whenever I talk about journalism, I say, just always remember that journalists, they're not robots, they're human beings, and all these sort of, cognitive shortcuts, the sort of social influence that we know from social psychology, group dynamics, they affect journalists too. So we can have access to as much information as possible, but if we're not building sort of checks on our own kind of psychological proclivities to find confirmation of our beliefs, then we're nowhere. We're not any better than we were before the information.
So last question, and then I'll let you go. The overall state of the nation, like, yeah. Do we have hope for this administration? Like, do we believe the United States will last past these 4 to 8 years? Like, should we be hopeful that this isn't a problem? This may be an aberration from what we're used to, but the system is designed to like not let anything really radical happen overnight. Or has the world shrunk to such a point that like we could wake up in the morning and North Korea is not here anymore?
Yeah, well, maybe I'm a little bit of a cockeyed optimist when it comes to the American political system. And I do remember the day after Donald Trump was elected the president of the United States, I had a lot of students quite discouraged and upset. And what I told them is that, this country, I think the political system has pretty strong muscles. And I think one thing that's happened in the last year or almost a year is that we've seen those muscles flexing. The system of checks and balances, even, again, as much as it's denigrated, it should be, the kind of system of political parties which has become so hyper-polarized. They are very strong checks. They're very strong brakes. And again, that has a downside too, because you're for radical change and you become very frustrated and exasperated. But if you're somebody who believes in the idea of continuity and stability and that change sometimes is more disruptive and more anxiety-inducing than stasis, what we're going through is a moment now where, again, if you're opposed to President Trump, you're finding that the political system has blocked him on a lot of different kinds of fronts. He's doing things through executive orders, obviously, we disagree with, but in terms of what's happening with Congress, in terms of what's happening in the executive establishment, again, the institutional, the muscles of the American political system have kicked in. Again, if you were a supporter of Barack Obama, those same muscles kicked in during that era, and you were very frustrated by that too. But if you're Barack Obama's opponent, you're like, okay, yeah, this is where the system of checks and balances comes in to kind of, in many ways, keep the ship of state from lifting too far to the left, right or left. So, as I said, I always have to be just sort of this qualifier that I'm probably a little too optimistic about the future of the country. But I think having a larger historical perspective can tell us that, we've been through periods of hyperpolarization before. We've been through periods in which we almost had, we had presidents who were pretty much delegitimized. Now, Donald Trump there's no doubt about that. We never quite had somebody with his sort of personality, his sort of set of goals in office before. So there is uncertainty. Certainly the international environment is one that causes one to have some trepidation about whether we're going to be able to navigate this world. You mentioned North Korea. So I will say that for what show it was on, but I was listening to some commentator who's an expert in nuclear arms saying that, about 30 years ago, if you asked a group of experts, in the nuclear lane, as we would say, about when do you think North Korea would be able to develop a kind of functional nuclear bomb, most of them said about 30 years. Any president who came into office at this moment would probably be confronting a very belligerent, very capable North Korea. So it's not as if suddenly like Trump, triggered North Korea's nuclear development program. They've been doing that for a long time. So there are things that would have happened regardless of whether Trump was in office or not. And I think actually that for me would be an important message for journalists, is to be very mindful about distinguishing, what, for want of a better word, is really Donald Trump's fault or Donald Trump's responsibility, and what are things that would happen to any Republican president or any Republican president would do, or what are things that would happen internationally regardless of whether you had Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in the White House.
I mean, and that makes sense. I mean, I think taking an optimistic approach is probably the best way to go about it anyway, especially since these are things that we can't necessarily control. And the system is designed to kind of to slow things down to a halt, even if it's the person that you're rooting for